The Public and Putin, Owning Public Space. We're going to briefly look at Putin as an individual and what he stands for, and that he represents a generational view, and that he is supported by many people who like at least the strong presidency, if don't necessarily agree with some of his policies. So Putin, who might have lived in the shadows earlier on as a KGB agent, is the spy who came in from the cold and loves a good photo op, as you can see in these wonderful images. So who is this Vladimir Putin? He was born in 1952 in what was then known as Leningrad, and he had what would be seemingly a typical Soviet childhood, as Putin has declared that I was a pure and utterly successful product of Soviet patriotic education. And he would like to have this Soviet patriotic education really be the basis, I think, of what is taught in schools, as we've seen in terms of the discussion of the creation of a core curriculum of history for Russia. And this view, I think, as we've seen in our readings, is shared and understood by the Putin generation. And then he went on to have a sort of fairly typical advanced education, went into law school, and then became a KGB operative in the remote area of Dresden in what we call East Germany. So he was a low-ranking bureaucrat in the KGB. But he returned to Leningrad after they collapsed the Soviet Union and worked for the mayor of Leningrad, a sort of rather progressive mayor, Anatoly Sobchak. And then he lost the mayoral election in 1996, which then led to Putin heading to Moscow, where all great things are supposed to happen. Moscow is the place of opportunity. And Yeltsin, he got Yeltsin's eye, and Yeltsin appointed him as the head of the FSB, or Federal Security Service. Then he became prime minister in the late summer of 1999. And then Yeltsin's December surprise then placed Putin in the position of acting president. And Yeltsin's December surprise was on December 31st, 1999. So really at the end of a century and the end of so much more. The presidential elections of Putin, I think, are interesting, and it's sort of a story of what Putin wants to make sure is seen as a very robust, well-supported, well-voted for presidency. In 2000, Putin received 56% of the votes. He had challengers, and he did not want this to happen again. And so he ensures it doesn't happen. In 2004, receiving 71.3% of the vote. Because he has 2 terms, then it was necessary for him to pick a candidate that would be essentially his sort of shadow presidency. With 2008 Medvedev, his interlude, where because he was chosen by Putin, he handily wins with 71.2%. Then in 2012, Putin comes back after taking this break to fulfill the criteria of not holding more than 2 consecutive terms, and his turnout is not as impressive. 63.6% as the percentage. So he makes a big comeback in 2018. What he wants is a big vote and a big win, and he does get that with 76.69% as the win. The term limits are 2 consecutive 6-year terms, which was raised from 4 years in December 2008. And I think what most people are wondering is who will Putin select to follow him following the 2016 term. That there's a speculation he will be willing to step down, but he will be very careful about who will follow him. And that raises the question of what is Russian, what is Soviet in terms of politics. And It is very complicated, as we have seen, and one U.S. ambassador described Putin as difficult to read as an individual, which I think sums up what many people feel, at least in the West. And he remains a political mystery to most. And I think Americans particularly struggle to understand Putin, whereas his generation in Russia do understand him quite well. Russia created a personalized presidency, which is not a surprise. And so the personalized presidency, which is a strong presidency, is able to control that image quite well, and able to control that image through the use of state-controlled media, such as TV. So the TV then promotes Putin's policies in terms of elections, promotes Putin far more than any other candidate. Airtime is given to Putin and his supporters and not really to anybody else. And also the governors, local power is done at the behest of Moscow, of the center. And so the local powers understand this sort of form of clientelism that the local bureaucrats, men in place, are indebted to the man in power, such as Putin, and will follow the marching orders. Putin likes to declare himself as above politics, and he proves this being above politics by running as an independent during these elections. Hence, he represents all Russians and no specific political party. What's important with these elections is to make sure that the vote gets out and that the vote shows that Putin is popular, and that there is control of this process. And I think we have definitely seen the role of controlling elections in the United States, and how Russians are able to very handily do this. The Putin generation, born between 1976 and 1991, as we've seen in our readings, have a great deal overall for Soviet nostalgia, even if the Russians are happy that the Soviet Union has collapsed. They miss parts of it. There is sort of a golden glow of that. And we've seen that with Homo sapiens, for example, in our other readings. And this generation would like to have a restoration of pride. They did not like the humiliation of what they endured during the collapse in the humiliating Yeltsin years. Many have embraced materialism and some kind of capitalism, but have not embraced Western-style democracy, and we have also discussed this. They're also anti-American, by and large. American rhetoric and policies have essentially reinforced Russian anti-U.S. government sentiments. The Americans have not fared well in U.S. opinion, at least American politics and the American government, even though the American population fares better. Overall, there's just a political apathy of the population, and I think this happens to most populations. The population wants stability, wants economic well-being, and pretty much is met with just indifference to politics. And again, I think this is very common around the globe. In 2007, a poll was given that 60% were not interested in politics, 24% were totally indifferent, with only 37% showing interest. And I think if we've already mentioned that indifference and apathy is the kiss of death for a well-functioned, vibrant democracy that is based on the participation of the citizenship. The Putin generation is by and large conservative in their outlook, and intolerance is seen as accepted. It is seen as a value that sort of marks Russian tradition. And I think one of the examples of this willingness to accept intolerance, a sort of traditional conservative-mindedness, is how homophobic Russian society still is in the 21st century. 74% of Russians don't think homosexuality should be accepted by society. And you can pause on this chart and look at it, that clearly Russian views of homosexuality does not coincide with Western European views of homosexuality in the least. So it's hard to see many of the Russian views as really coinciding with what Western European views are. Likewise, Russians view themselves as very sort of attractive in their traits, as you can see in the Russian current opinions of themselves as compared to Ukrainians, that they are hospitable and open, straightforward, and sympathetic. So, and they also believe, by and large, almost 50% of the population, that the world is run by certain secret groups that control various governments, and so it makes you kind of wonder. The Russians continue to drink a great deal of hard liquor, and also Putin's popularity remains quite high. And how much do Russians trust various institutions in Russia? Well, as we've seen from our readings, that the president receives high rates of trust, whereas the police do not. The police are feared, not respected, called werewolves in uniform. In a 2004 survey, 1 in 4 Russians are victim of police abuse, and there's seen as a great deal of corruption in the police force. The mass media is controlled by the president, so the president is able to get out a good story. And the army, as we've seen from our readings, suffered terribly during the Yeltsin years in an attempt to sort of rebuild that. The health of society as a whole is pretty grim. The 2005 life expectancy for men was 58.6 years. This is a very low life expectancy for what was supposed to be one of the superpowers. And you can read more about this. Pause this slide. The 2006 Scientific Center of Children's Health says that 45% of all Russian children are born with health deviations. Again, shocking for what should be a first world power, not engaging in insufficient birth rates and numerous health issues. Finally, the Russian parliament began to address the AIDS crisis, the HIV/AIDS crisis, after ignoring it and refusing to say that it existed in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet. Many Russians still think that AIDS is a foreign plot to weaken Russia and refuse to really acknowledge it as anything as some sort of Russian, American conspiracy. And to make matters worse, the military leaders claim that only 10% of new draftees are capable of withstanding boot camp, which would mean 90% are unfit. Wowie. But Putin is popular in part because he's strong and he's tough. He battles the oligarchs that were seen as this corruptive force during the Yeltsin years and seemingly wins, even though, of course, what happens is that the state becomes sort of the oligarch. Politics and economics are intertwined, and Putin's clique gains control of the assets that had been privatized and essentially gains control of this small oligarch of the government, with Putin at the top gaining control of these assets. And he essentially re-Sovietized the media, so it's all good news about Putin. Russian billionaires flee to Kensington, and if they don't flee, they get arrested, including the tycoon Boris Berezovsky, who had controlled oil, automobiles, media outlets, and state TV network ORT during the Yeltsin years. He was worth about £2 billion and was buying up London real estate. And then there also was the oligarch Roman Abramovich, who owns the Chelsea soccer team, and in 2005 was estimated having wealth close to £5 billion. So there's of these very wealthy expats of Russia, these oligarchs that live tax-free as long as they do not earn income in Britain. There's also the problem of the Russian mafias, and if you've seen Eastern Promises, this movie, you're very familiar with how this is portrayed in the film. And voters are concerned about corruption and disorder and believe that Putin, as a strong man, is able to try to get a better handle on it. And so this organized crime that is systematic and epidemic throughout Russia and the world, and it goes global, and it's tremendously important to realize how effective it is and having control of many resources, as you can see from this slide. We'll look more later.